My mother-in-law held that contract like it was my death sentence. The Sunday dinner table stretched between us like a battlefield, and Margaret Martinez sat at the head like the queen she'd always believed herself to be. Me? I was at the far end where the help sits, where the woman who built a six-figure business from her garage gets placed when family hierarchy matters more than respect. "Rebecca, honey," Margaret's voice dripped with false sweetness, "we need to discuss your little hobby." Her manicured fingers tapped against the manila envelope beside her plate. David sat silent, cutting his roast beef with surgical precision, avoiding my eyes. That should have been my first warning. What they didn't know was that while they were planning my downfall, I'd already bought Margaret's house 3 months ago. The eviction notice was sitting in my car, waiting for the perfect moment. They wanted to play games with my life? Fine. But they forgot one crucial detail. I don't lose. The chandelier above us cast long shadows across the mahogany table, the same table where I'd celebrated 10 years of business milestones, 10 years of Margaret's backhanded compliments about my cute little jewelry business, 10 years of her treating my handcrafted pieces like garage sale trinkets while wearing the $3,000 necklace I'd made for her birthday. I'd built my business from nothing. Started in our garage with a soldering iron and a dream, working nights after my day job as a real estate analyst, every weekend at craft fairs, every late night designing custom pieces, every rejection that taught me to come back stronger. My client list now included celebrities and politicians, but to Margaret it would always be Rebecca's hobby. "The tax implications alone," she continued, gesturing with her wine glass, "are probably beyond what you can handle. Business ownership is complicated, dear. Maybe it's time to let the adults take over." David's fork clinked against his plate. Still silence. My husband of 8 years couldn't even look at me while his mother dissected my life's work. The same man who'd held me while I cried over my first failed batch of silver rings, who'd celebrated when I landed my first major client, who'd promised to always have my back. But Margaret knew things. Too many things. Details about my quarterly earnings, my supplier contracts, my expansion plans. Information I'd only shared with David during our private conversations. The puzzle pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Have you ever felt invisible during family meetings? That moment when you realize you're not part of the conversation, you're the topic of it? That's exactly how I felt as Margaret's smile grew wider and David's silence stretched longer. And that's when I realized David had been feeding information to his mother for months. The envelope sat there like a loaded weapon. Margaret's perfectly polished nails drummed against it in rhythm with my heartbeat. "Now, Rebecca, I know this might seem sudden, but we've had lawyers look into this." Lawyers. Plural. This wasn't a spontaneous family intervention. This was a calculated attack. Look into what, exactly? I finally found my voice, though it came out steadier than I felt. Your business structure, dear. The liability issues, the way it affects David's credit, our family's reputation. She opened the envelope with theatrical precision, pulling out a stack of papers thick enough to choke on. This is a transfer agreement. Very simple, really. You sign the business over to David and we'll handle all the complicated business matters from here. The words hit me like ice water. Transfer agreement. Sign over. We'll handle. I glanced at David, searching for any sign that this was some cruel joke. Instead, I saw guilt written across his face like a confession. His mother continued talking, but her words faded into white noise as the truth crystallized. This wasn't about protecting me or helping the family. This was about taking everything I'd built and putting it under male control, Margaret's control, disguised as David's name on the paperwork. "Of course, you'll still be involved," Margaret added with that patronizing smile I'd learned to hate. "We wouldn't want to cut you out completely. Think of it as professional management. You can focus on the creative side while we handle the business side." Creative side. Like I hadn't been handling every aspect of operations for a decade. like I hadn't negotiated contracts, managed inventory, built client relationships, and grown revenue by 300% in the last 3 years alone. Evidence had been mounting for weeks, and I'd been too trusting to see it. Margaret's sudden interest in my little business, her pointed questions about my client base, the way she'd steered conversations toward my financial projections during family dinners for the good of the family. That phrase had become Margaret's battle cry, her justification for every manipulation and power play. But this time, she'd overplayed her hand. Because while Margaret thought she held all the cards, she'd forgotten that I wasn't just some naive housewife. I was the woman who'd analyzed property values and investment portfolios before I'd ever touched a jewelry tool. I was the woman who'd quietly tracked every financial move this family made while they assumed I was too focused on pretty baubles to notice their debts. The ultimatum came with dessert, served alongside Margaret's homemade apple pie like poison wrapped in tradition. Sign the papers, Rebecca, or David files for divorce Monday morning. Her voice remained pleasant, conversational, as if she'd just offered me coffee instead of threatening to destroy my marriage. We've already consulted with attorneys. Your business would be considered marital property anyway. This way is cleaner for everyone. David still wouldn't meet my eyes. My husband, my partner, my supposed teammate in life, sat there letting his mother deliver ultimatums about our marriage like she was reading the weather forecast. Choice: lose my business or lose my marriage. 10 years of building something from nothing, or 8 years of a relationship that apparently meant so little to my husband that he'd let his mother orchestrate its destruction. But as I stared at those papers, at Margaret's expectant face, at David's guilty profile, I realized something they'd both forgotten, something crucial. I don't just create beautiful things, I solve problems. And Margaret Martinez had just become my biggest problem yet. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of this game since the day I'd overheard her on the phone with David's lawyer 6 months ago. What she didn't realize was that while she'd been planning to take my business, I'd been planning something much bigger. The woman sitting at the head of that table, demanding I sign away my life's work, was about to learn that some battles aren't won by force. They're won by patience, preparation, and knowing exactly where your opponent is most vulnerable. Margaret wanted to play chess with my future? Perfect. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd assumed I was just a pawn. I wasn't Margaret's victim. I was her next lesson in underestimating the wrong woman. See, Margaret thought she knew me, thought I was the soft-spoken daughter-in-law who'd quietly absorbed years of criticism and condescension. The woman who'd smile politely while being told my business was just a hobby, who'd accept being seated at the children's end of the table during family gatherings. But Margaret had never bothered to ask about my life before David. She'd never wondered why someone with a little jewelry business could afford the designer clothes in my closet or the luxury car in their driveway. She'd assumed David was funding my lifestyle, never considering that maybe, just maybe, I was funding his. What Margaret didn't know was that before I became Rebecca Martinez, the jewelry maker, I was Rebecca Chen, senior real estate analyst at Morrison & Associates. I'd spent 5 years dissecting property values, tracking market trends, and analyzing investment portfolios for high net worth clients. I knew how to read financial statements like some people read novels, and I'd been reading Margaret's for months. While she'd been plotting to take my business, I'd been quietly documenting every financial move the Martinez family made, every mortgage payment, every credit card statement, every small loan David had requested from his trust fund. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. Margaret's house, the family estate she'd inherited and treated like her personal kingdom, was mortgaged to the hilt. She'd been pulling equity for years, funding David's failed restaurant venture, his brother's construction business that never got off the ground, and her own expensive tastes. The property that should have been worth $800,000 free and clear now carried a $600,000 mortgage that Margaret was struggling to service. Can you guess what I'd been preparing while Margaret planned my destruction? I'd been watching the foreclosure notices. I'd been building relationships with asset managers at regional banks. And 3 months ago, when Margaret's house finally entered pre-foreclosure, I'd made a private offer to purchase the debt. For $650,000, I now owned the mortgage on Margaret's family legacy. The house she'd lived in for 30 years, the address that anchored her social status, the property she'd assumed would always be her safety net, it all belonged to me now. Margaret sat there demanding I sign over my business empire, completely unaware that I already owned her kingdom. The irony was delicious. While she'd been scheming to take the company I'd built with my own hands, I'd been quietly acquiring the foundation of her entire identity. Margaret Martinez, the woman who'd spent years telling me I wasn't worthy of carrying the family name, was about to learn that names on deeds matter more than names on marriage certificates. But I wasn't done yet. See, buying Margaret's debt was just the beginning. The real masterstroke was what came next. I'd restructured my business 6 months ago, creating a complex web of LLCs and partnerships that would make Margaret's head spin. The jewelry company she thought she was stealing? It was now just one subsidiary of a larger operation. The real assets, the client relationships, the intellectual property, all safely protected in entities that weren't part of the transfer she was demanding. Margaret could have the empty shell of my original business structure. She could have the outdated equipment and the lease on my old workshop space. But the heart of what I'd built, the custom client list worth millions, the exclusive design patents, the relationships with high-end retailers, all of that existed in companies she'd never even heard of. Hidden allies had made this possible. Sarah Chen, my former colleague from Morrison & Associates, now a corporate attorney specializing in asset protection. Marcus Rodriguez, my accountant who'd helped structure deals for celebrities hiding assets from divorces. People who understood that sometimes you have to lose a battle to win a war. The contract signing was scheduled for next Sunday. Margaret had chosen the date deliberately. Another family dinner, another power play at her dining room table. She wanted witnesses to my surrender, wanted the whole family to see Rebecca finally put in her place. What she didn't realize was that she'd chosen the perfect stage for her own downfall. Because while Margaret planned her victory celebration, process servers were preparing documents. While she practiced her speech about what's best for the family, eviction notices were being printed with her name at the top. Margaret wanted to make my business transfer a public spectacle? Perfect. Because I was about to give her the audience she deserved. But as the contract signing day approached, I discovered something that changed everything. Something that made Margaret's betrayal cut even deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about my business. This wasn't even just about money or power or family hierarchy. David had been planning this for over a year. I found the evidence tucked away in his home office, in a folder labeled Family Financial Planning. Meeting notes with Margaret's attorney dating back 13 months, strategy sessions about Rebecca's business problem, discussions about divorce proceedings if I refused to cooperate voluntarily. My marriage hadn't just been damaged by this scheme, it had been a foundation of it. David hadn't been caught between his wife and his mother. He'd been Margaret's co-conspirator from the beginning. Every family dinner where I'd felt excluded, every conversation that stopped when I walked into the room, every time Margaret had made pointed comments about my business, David had been feeding her information. He'd been the inside source, mapping out my weaknesses, documenting my fears, helping his mother identify exactly where to strike for maximum damage. The man I'd trusted with my dreams, my insecurities, my business plans, and my heart had been systematically cataloging it all for his mother's war against me. Have you ever realized that your marriage was a lie? That the person sleeping next to you every night had been plotting your destruction during breakfast conversations with his mother? The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was intimately, devastatingly personal. Margaret had orchestrated this takeover, but David had made it possible. They'd turned our marriage into a reconnaissance mission, our family dinners into strategy sessions, our home into enemy territory where I was the only one who didn't know we were at war. Every Sunday dinner for the past year had been a planning meeting. Margaret's questions about my client base weren't motherly interest. They were intelligence gathering. David's suggestions about business expansion weren't supportive. They were ways to identify vulnerabilities. The family meetings where I'd felt invisible weren't because they were excluding me. They were about me. Every single one. Past events took on new meaning with this revelation. Margaret's sudden interest in meeting my major clients wasn't social. She'd been building relationships to steal them later. David's questions about my business insurance weren't concern for our financial security. He'd been helping his mother understand exactly what assets were available to seize. Even our intimate moments had been contaminated. Late-night conversations where I'd shared my fears about cash flow during slow seasons, my worries about expanding too fast, my dreams of opening a flagship store. All of it had been reported back to Margaret like intelligence from the field. The broken glass of my trust reflected a shattered reality. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my family, my place in the Martinez dynasty, all of it had been carefully constructed fiction designed to keep me compliant while they positioned themselves to take everything I'd built. But Margaret had made one crucial miscalculation in her year-long campaign against me. She'd assumed that because I'd been naive enough to trust David, I'd be naive enough to trust everyone else. She'd assumed that because I'd been vulnerable in my marriage, I'd be defenseless in business. She'd forgotten that the woman who'd built a jewelry empire from nothing might have learned a few things about protecting what matters. Margaret wanted a war? She was about to get one. But the battlefield wouldn't be her dining room table, and the weapons wouldn't be contracts and ultimatums. The war would be fought with the one thing Margaret valued more than power over others: her own security. Her house, her status, her reputation, everything she'd sacrificed my marriage to protect. And the battle was about to begin at next Sunday's dinner, with an eviction notice served alongside dessert. Contract signing day arrived with the weight of destiny. Margaret had planned this moment like a coronation, every detail choreographed for maximum psychological impact. The good china, the formal dining room, the entire extended Martinez family summoned to witness my surrender. I sat at that familiar table surrounded by David's siblings and their spouses, their children playing in the next room while the adults gathered to watch Margaret claim her prize. The contract lay before me like a surrender document, its legal language dense with the architecture of my defeat. "Rebecca, dear," Margaret began, her voice carrying the satisfaction of inevitable victory, "I want you to know this really is for the good of the family." There it was, her favorite phrase, the one she'd weaponized to justify every manipulation and power grab over the years. David sat beside me, his presence a mockery of marital support. His hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed protective to outside observers, but felt like a handler ensuring compliance. We'd barely spoken since I'd discovered his role in this conspiracy. What was there to say to someone who'd been documenting your weaknesses for over a year? "The business will be in much better hands," Margaret continued, her audience hanging on every word. "David has such a good head for these things. And Rebecca, you'll be free to focus on what you're truly good at, the creative side, the fun part, without all that boring business responsibility." The condescension was thick enough to cut. Around the table, nods of approval from family members who'd never asked about my business, never shown interest in what I'd built, but were perfectly willing to watch it be transferred to male management for everyone's good. Margaret's speech built to its crescendo, the pen placed before me with ceremonial weight. "This is what's best for everyone," she declared, the phrase twisted into a weapon that had nothing to do with family welfare and everything to do with power. I picked up the pen. Margaret's smile widened. David's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly. Whether from nervousness or anticipation, I couldn't tell. And then I signed my name across the signature line, transferring ownership of Rebecca's Designs, LLC, to David Martinez. Margaret's triumph was immediate and visible. She actually clasped her hands together like she'd won the lottery. "Welcome to proper business management, dear," she cooed, already reaching for the documents to secure her victory. But victory has a funny way of turning bitter when you don't understand what you've actually won. What Margaret didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that Rebecca's Designs LLC was now essentially an empty box. A beautiful, legally binding, empty box with David's name on it. The company she'd just claimed carried exactly $847 in assets, 3 pieces of outdated equipment, and a lease on a workshop space I'd already planned to abandon. Everything valuable. The client database worth 6 figures, the exclusive design patents, the relationships with luxury retailers, the custom work agreements with celebrities, all of that existed in RMJ Holdings, Martinez Creative Enterprises, and Chen Design Studios. Companies incorporated in different states, with different tax structures, with different ownership models that would take Margaret's lawyers months to even understand, let alone unravel. David now owned a business with all the legal liabilities, but none of the actual assets. Congratulations, honey. You just inherited responsibility for lease payments, equipment maintenance, and vendor contracts, while the profitable parts of my operation continued under different names. But the evening was far from over. Margaret was still basking in her victory, already making plans for restructuring my empty business, when the doorbell rang. She glanced at the clock with mild irritation. 7:30 p.m. wasn't typically calling hours for the Martinez family. "I'll get it," she announced, probably expecting a neighbor or maybe a delivery. The family continued their celebration, toasting David's new business ownership with wine and congratulations, while I sat quietly, waiting. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the foyer. The front door opened. Voices, professional, formal, unfamiliar. "Mrs. Margaret Martinez? I have documents that require your immediate attention." The conversation at the dinner table faltered as Margaret's voice carried back to us, higher pitch now, confused. "Documents? What kind of documents? It's Sunday evening." "Ma'am, these are foreclosure proceedings and notice of ownership transfer. You need to review these carefully. Is there somewhere private we can discuss this?" Foreclosure. Ownership transfer. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. David's face went white. His siblings exchanged confused glances. Children's laughter from the next room continued, oblivious to the adult world shifting on its axis. Margaret returned to the dining room with papers clutched in her trembling hands, her triumphant composure cracking like thin ice. "There's been some mistake," she announced, but her voice lacked conviction. "Someone is claiming they own our house." I stood up slowly, drawing every eye in the room. "There's no mistake, Margaret." The silence was absolute. 3 months ago, when your mortgage went into pre-foreclosure, I purchased the debt from Regional First Bank. For the record, that makes me your landlord now. Margaret's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications hit her. "That's impossible. This house has been in the Martinez family for 30 years. And it was mortgaged for $600,000 to fund David's restaurant, Carlos's construction business, and your lifestyle for the past decade. When you stopped making payments 6 months ago, the bank was happy to sell me the note at a discount." David found his voice. "Rebecca, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I own your mother's house, David. The same house where she just forced me to sign away my business for the good of the family." I turned to address the room, making sure every family member understood exactly what had happened. Margaret wanted to play games with ownership and control, so let's talk about ownership and control. The process server had left eviction paperwork, 30 days' notice to vacate or begin paying rent to the new owner. Me. Margaret sank into her chair. The woman who'd been queen of her domain just minutes ago now grappling with the reality that her kingdom had new management. But this is our family home, our legacy. And my business was my legacy, I replied calmly. But apparently, family legacies are just business assets to be redistributed for the good of the family. At least that's what you taught me tonight. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on anyone. Margaret had just finished a speech about proper business management and adult decision-making, only to discover that the woman she'd been lecturing owned the roof over her head. David stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been planning to steal my business, David?" The question cut through the room like a blade. "Because I found your meeting notes with your mother's attorney, 13 months of strategy sessions about Rebecca's business problem. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Margaret's eviction notice lay on the table beside the contract transferring my business to David. 2 pieces of paper that told the complete story of what happened when someone underestimated Rebecca Martinez. "For the good of the family," I repeated Margaret's favorite phrase, but now it carried a different weight entirely. "Isn't that what you said, Margaret? Sometimes tough decisions have to be made for the good of the family?" The Sunday dinner that was supposed to be my surrender had become Margaret's reckoning, and we were just getting started. The room erupted in chaos after my revelation. David's sister, Maria, started crying, worried about where Margaret would live. His brother Carlos looked panicked, probably calculating how this affected his own financial arrangements with the family matriarch. The children's laughter from the next room seemed obscene against the backdrop of adult lives imploding. But Margaret was staring at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before, respect mixed with pure terror. "You can't do this," David stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. "There has to be some legal recourse?" I interrupted. "Like the legal contract I just signed transferring my business to you, the one your mother spent over a year orchestrating with lawyers?" I gestured to the eviction papers scattered across the mahogany table. "Everything I did was completely legal, David. I learned from the best. What none of them realized yet was that signing away my business wasn't surrender. It was the opening move in a much larger game. See, while Margaret had been focused on seizing my jewelry company, she'd missed the real prize. The business she'd just claimed was about to become her worst nightmare, because Rebecca's Designs LLC didn't just transfer empty assets to David, it transferred the debts, too. "Margaret," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd perfected in boardrooms, "did your lawyers explain to you what happens when someone takes ownership of a business without standing vendor contracts?" Her face went pale. She hadn't thought about the liabilities. David now owns a company that owes $180,000 to suppliers, has lease obligations on equipment worth $75,000, and carries liability insurance premiums of $3,200 monthly. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the financial documents I'd prepared. Oh, and there's that lawsuit from the client who claimed design theft. That's still pending. Congratulations, honey. You just inherited my legal problems along with my empty business. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Margaret's master plan had just become David's financial disaster. But the beautiful part? All of that debt was real. I'd structured it carefully over the past 6 months, moving profitable operations to my new companies while loading the original LLC with legitimate business obligations. Margaret wanted my business, she could have it, along with every bill, every contract dispute, and every liability that came with it. The best part, I continued, savoring the moment, is that as the new business owner, David is personally liable for all outstanding debts. That's what happens when you don't read the fine print before forcing someone to sign contracts. Margaret's victory celebration had turned into a wake for her family's financial security. She'd successfully stolen a business that was about to bankrupt her son. But I wasn't finished revealing the true scope of what I'd orchestrated. David, remember when you asked me to co-sign that loan for your mother's house renovations last year? His eyes widened as the memory surfaced. The one where you said it was just a formality, that Margaret would handle all the payments? Nods around the table. Everyone remembered Margaret's kitchen renovation, the new hardwood floors, the expensive landscaping that had made her the envy of the neighborhood. Well, when I bought Margaret's mortgage from the bank, I also acquired all associated debts, including that $45,000 home improvement loan that you personally guaranteed. I smiled at my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, with satisfaction that felt better than any piece of jewelry I'd ever created. So not only do you now own a failing business with massive debts, but you're also responsible for the loan payments on a house you don't own anymore. The mathematical beauty of it was stunning. David now carried business liabilities of over $200,000, plus personal guarantees on loans for a house that belonged to me. Margaret had orchestrated her son's complete financial destruction while thinking she was securing his future. But wait, I said, holding up one finger like a game show host about to reveal the grand prize. There's more. I'd been planning this moment for months, choreographing every revelation for maximum impact. The lawyer documents, the business transfer, the eviction notice, all of that was just the overture. The real symphony was about to begin. Margaret, do you remember your charity auction last month? The one where you donated my custom necklace for the Children's Hospital fundraiser? She nodded weakly, probably wondering where this was heading. The necklace that sold for $12,000 to benefit sick children? Yes, but... The necklace you donated without asking my permission, the one you took from my workshop and claimed was a family contribution. My voice hardened. That wasn't charity, Margaret, that was theft. And thanks to the new business ownership structure David just inherited, he's now legally responsible for that theft. The charity auction theft was the piece de resistance, because when you steal someone's artwork and auction it publicly, there's a paper trail, witnesses, documentation, and now that David owned my business, he owned responsibility for all crimes committed using company assets. I could press charges, I continued, watching Margaret's face cycle through every stage of grief simultaneously. Theft of intellectual property, fraud, misrepresentation to a charitable organization. But I won't, because David is going to make it right. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, counting down the seconds until Margaret's world finished collapsing. Here's what's going to happen, I announced, standing to address the entire family like a CEO delivering quarterly results. David will use his new business to pay back every penny of that stolen charity money, plus interest. Margaret will either start paying rent on my house or find somewhere else to live. And both of you will sign affidavits admitting that my business was acquired through coercion and fraud. But even as I delivered this ultimatum, I could see the hollow victory forming. Margaret was broken, yes. David was financially ruined, yes. But everyone in that room was looking at me like I'd become a monster. Maria spoke first, her voice shaking with emotion. Rebecca, how could you do this to family? Family. The word tasted bitter now. I loved this family, I replied, my composure finally cracking. I spent 8 years trying to earn Margaret's respect, trying to be worthy of the Martinez name. I built a business that employed 12 people, that supported not just David and me, but contributed to family expenses, family vacations, family emergencies, and the thanks I got was a year-long conspiracy to steal everything I'd built. Carlos shifted uncomfortably. But Margaret's just looking out for the family's best interests? By destroying mine? The words came out sharper than I intended. By turning my own husband into a spy against me? By treating my life's work like a toy that could be redistributed at will? The children's voices from the next room seemed to come from another universe, innocent and carefree, while the adult world burned around them. David's 8-year-old nephew ran into the dining room, stopping short when he saw all the serious faces and papers scattered across the table. "Why is everyone sad?" he asked, with the directness that only children possess. No one knew how to answer him. How do you explain to a child that his aunt just destroyed his grandmother's life in revenge for his grandmother trying to destroy hers? How do you tell him that the adults he trusted to keep his world stable had been playing war games with each other for over a year? "Go play with your cousins," Maria whispered, gently steering him back toward the other room. But the damage was done. The child's question hung in the air like an accusation. What had I become? I looked around the table at faces that had once felt like family. Margaret, broken and aging before my eyes. David, stunned into silence by the magnitude of his financial ruin. His siblings, confused and hurt by the warfare that had erupted in their safe family space. I'd won. I'd systematically dismantled every weapon they'd tried to use against me and turned their own tactics into their destruction. But victory felt like ash in my mouth. Because Margaret wasn't just the woman who'd tried to steal my business. She was also the woman who'd taught me to make her famous apple pie, who'd held my hand in the hospital when I'd miscarried 3 years ago, who'd been genuinely proud when my jewelry was featured in a national magazine, even if she'd never admit it publicly. David wasn't just the man who'd betrayed me for over a year. He was also the man who'd proposed to me in the workshop where I'd built my first business, surrounded by sketches and half-finished pieces, who'd believed in my dreams when everyone else called them hobbies. The family sitting around this table wasn't just a collection of conspirators and enemies. They were also the people who'd celebrated my birthdays, who'd included me in holiday traditions, who'd made me feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time since my own parents died. But they'd also been willing to destroy me for what they perceived as the greater good. They'd been willing to sacrifice my dreams, my security, my identity, because maintaining traditional family power structures mattered more than protecting the person I was. The truly terrifying part wasn't what they'd done to me. It was what I'd become in response. I'd turned into exactly the kind of person they'd always claimed I was. Calculating, manipulative, focused on material gain over family harmony. I'd proven every criticism Margaret had ever made about me being an outsider, someone who didn't understand family loyalty. Except that wasn't entirely true either, because family loyalty should flow both ways. Love should be protected, not weaponized. Trust should be earned through honesty, not destroyed through year-long deceptions. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking an hour since the process server had delivered Margaret's eviction notice, an hour since I'd revealed the true scope of my counterattack, an hour since this family had learned that the quiet daughter-in-law they'd underestimated was capable of systematic destruction. "I need some air," I announced, walking toward the French doors that led to Margaret's garden. My garden now, technically. But David's voice stopped me. "Rebecca, wait." I turned to find my husband standing, his face a map of emotions I couldn't read. "We need to talk, privately." The garden had always been Margaret's pride. Meticulously maintained roses, perfectly manicured lawns, a fountain that cost more than most people's cars. She'd spent hours out here, tending to beauty that would outlast temporary family dramas. Or so she'd thought. "Did you plan all this from the beginning?" David asked as we walked among the rose bushes his mother had planted 15 years ago. "Plan what? To protect myself from being destroyed by people I trusted? You know what I mean." His voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than this single evening. "The house, the business restructuring, the debt transfers. How long have you been setting this up?" I stopped walking and turned to face him in the moonlight. "Since the day I overheard you talking to your mother's lawyer last February, since I realized my husband was planning my financial destruction behind my back." It wasn't supposed to be destruction, he said quietly. It was supposed to be protection. Your business was growing so fast, the liability exposure was enormous. If something went wrong, if someone sued you, everything we'd built together could have been lost. So you decided to steal it from me first? Take control of it. Put it under family protection. Make sure it was managed properly. He was repeating Margaret's talking points, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Without asking me, without trusting me, without considering that maybe the woman who built a 6-figure business from nothing might know how to protect it herself. David sat heavily on the stone bench beside Margaret's prized rose garden. You're right. We should have talked to you directly, should have asked instead of assuming, should have trusted you to make good decisions about your own creation. The admission felt too little, too late. But it also felt like the first honest thing he'd said to me in over a year. David, did you ever love me for who I actually am? Or did you love the version of me that fit into your family's expectations? He was quiet for a long time, staring at the fountain that would soon belong to whoever I decided to sell this house to. I loved that you were different, that you came from outside our world, that you built something beautiful with your hands instead of inheriting it from previous generations. And then you tried to take that away from me. And then I got scared that different meant dangerous, that your independence meant you didn't need us, didn't need me. His voice broke slightly. Mother convinced me that if we didn't control your business, we'd lose you entirely, that successful women like you always leave their families behind. The twisted logic was almost too painful to process. They'd tried to destroy my independence because they were afraid I'd use it to leave them. They'd created the exact scenario they'd been trying to prevent. David, did it ever occur to you that the way to keep someone is to love and support them, not to sabotage and control them? It does now. We sat in silence among Margaret's roses, two people who'd shared a life and a bed and dreams for 8 years, trying to figure out if anything real remained between us. What happens now? He asked finally. That was the question, wasn't it? I'd won the war, but I'd destroyed my own life in the process. I owned Margaret's house, but had lost my family. I'd protected my business, but ruined my marriage. I'd proven my strength, but isolated myself from everyone I'd once cared about. I don't know, I admitted. I never planned past tonight, past proving that you couldn't just take everything I'd built and expect me to smile about it. The business debts I inherited, are they real? Every penny. But David, they're also manageable if you're willing to work with me instead of against me. Hope flickered in his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, maybe there's a way to fix this that doesn't destroy everyone involved. Maybe there's a way to restructure everything so that Margaret keeps her house, you don't go bankrupt, and I don't have to be the villain in my own life story. It was a radical thought. After everything they'd done, after all the betrayal and manipulation and lies, I was considering offering them a way out. Why would you do that? David asked. After everything we put you through, why would you help us? I looked up at the stars, visible despite the city lights, constant despite human drama playing out below them. Because destroying you doesn't actually fix what's broken, because revenge feels powerful in the moment, but leaves you empty afterward. Because maybe the real victory isn't proving I can be as manipulative as Margaret. Maybe it's proving I can be better than that. But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. The woman sitting in that garden wasn't the same person who'd built her first jewelry piece in a garage workshop. That woman had been trusting, optimistic, focused on creation rather than destruction. This woman, the one who'd systematically dismantled her family's financial security while they ate apple pie, was someone harder. Someone who'd learned that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Someone who'd discovered that sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to become exactly what you're fighting against. The question was, which version of myself did I want to be moving forward? There's something else. David said quietly. "Something I need to tell you before you decide whether to help us or let us burn." My stomach clenched. After everything that had been revealed tonight, there was more? Mother's house isn't the only property in trouble. The family business, Carlos's construction company, Maria's restaurant investment, we're all connected financially. If everything collapses, it won't just be Mother and me who lose everything. The scope of the financial interconnection hit me like a physical blow. Margaret hadn't just been risking her own security when she'd over-leveraged the house. She'd been gambling with her children's futures, her grandchildren's inheritance, the entire family's stability. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Without the income from your business that Mother was counting on, and with the debts I just inherited, the whole family structure could collapse within 6 months. Maria's kids might have to change schools. Carlos could lose his house. The grandchildren could lose their college funds." Innocent casualties. That phrase from my outline echoed in my mind as I realized the true scope of what my revenge had set in motion. I hadn't just destroyed Margaret and David. I'd potentially destroyed an entire extended family, including children who'd never done anything worse than love their grandmother and trust the adults to keep their world stable. Jesus, David. Why didn't anyone tell me how interconnected everything was? Because Mother didn't want you to know how much power you actually had. She was afraid that if you understood how central your business income was to the family's financial stability, you'd use it as leverage. Which was exactly what I'd just done, even without knowing the full extent of the damage. The garden suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. I'd set out to protect myself from being destroyed by Margaret's schemes, but I'd ended up potentially destroying an entire family tree. But the situation was even more complex than David was admitting. "There's something you're not telling me," I said, studying his face in the moonlight. "Something about why Margaret was so desperate to control my business specifically." David's silence stretched too long. "David, what aren't you telling me?" He took a deep breath. "Mother has been using your business success as collateral for family loans for the past 2 years. She's been telling banks and investors that the family controls a profitable design company, that your income was guaranteed family income." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret hadn't just wanted to steal my business. She'd already been using it as collateral without my knowledge. She'd been leveraging my success to secure loans for the entire family, promising my future earnings to pay for their current expenses. She's been writing checks against my business without telling me? Not directly, but she's been guaranteeing family loans based on projected income from your company. If you'd pulled out or sold to someone else, she wouldn't have been able to make the payments. I stood up abruptly, pacing among the roses that no longer seemed beautiful, but felt like a perfectly manicured prison. So this whole scheme wasn't just about control or family hierarchy. This was about survival. Margaret was facing financial ruin if she couldn't guarantee my future earnings. "She was trying to protect everyone," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was trying to save herself by enslaving me." The anger returned, white-hot and cleansing. She turned my success into family debt without my consent, then tried to steal my business when she couldn't pay what she'd promised. The manipulation was even deeper than I'd realized. Margaret hadn't just been a controlling mother-in-law drunk on power. She'd been a desperate woman who'd gambled her family's future on my labor and panicked when she realized she couldn't control the outcome. But that didn't make what she'd done acceptable. If anything, it made it worse. "David, did you know about the loans when you started feeding her information about my business?" His silence was answer enough. "Jesus Christ, you weren't just helping her steal my company. You were helping her cover up the fact that she'd already been stealing from it for years." I was done. Done with the explanations, done with the justifications, done with the endless layers of betrayal that kept revealing themselves like some horrible Matryoshka doll of deception. "Here's what's going to happen," I announced, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned in boardrooms and refined through months of strategic planning. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call every bank, every investor, every person Margaret made promises to about my business income. You're going to explain that those guarantees were made without my knowledge or consent, and that I'm not responsible for covering loans I never agreed to. Rebecca, that will destroy, it will reveal the truth, which is that Margaret has been running a con game using my success as bait, and now that game is over. But even as I issued the ultimatum, I could see the human cost. Maria's children, Carlos's employees, Margaret's grandchildren, who'd grown up assuming their college funds were secure. The choice was becoming clear, and it wasn't between revenge and forgiveness. It was between justice and mercy, between protecting myself and protecting innocent people who'd been caught in the crossfire of their parents' bad decisions. There is another option, I said slowly, the plan forming as I spoke. But it requires everyone to tell the truth and agree to new terms. What kind of terms? The kind where Margaret admits what she's done, where you admit what you've done, and where we restructure everything so that I'm protected, but the family doesn't have to lose everything. David looked up with desperate hope. You'd do that? After everything? I'd do that because the alternative is becoming the kind of person who punishes children for their grandparents' mistakes. And because maybe, just maybe, there's a way to rebuild this family on honest foundations instead of the manipulation and lies it's been built on for the past 2 years. But the decision wasn't just about mercy. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be moving forward. I could be the woman who'd systematically destroyed everyone who'd hurt her, who'd proven that crossing Rebecca Martinez came with devastating consequences. That woman was powerful, untouchable, feared. Or I could be the woman who'd been strong enough to win the war, but wise enough to choose a better peace. That woman might be vulnerable again, might be setting herself up for future betrayal, but she'd also be someone who could sleep at night. David, if I help fix this mess, things between us can never go back to the way they were. I know. I mean it. The marriage we had was built on lies and manipulation. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, as spouses, as business partners, as anything, it has to be built on completely different foundations. What would that look like? I considered the question carefully. It would look like you earning back my trust instead of assuming you deserve it. It would look like Margaret respecting my autonomy instead of trying to control my decisions. It would look like this family treating me like an equal partner instead of a resource to be managed. And if we can't do that, then I walk away with my business empire intact, Margaret loses her house, and you handle your inherited debts however you can manage. The difference is that I'll have given you the choice to do better, instead of just destroying you because I could. The garden was getting cold, and somewhere in the house the rest of the family was probably still sitting around that dining room table, trying to process what had happened to their world. We should go back inside, David said finally, see if there's anything left to salvage. But as we walked back toward the house, I realized that the most important thing I needed to salvage wasn't my marriage or my relationship with Margaret, or even the family dynamics that had shaped the last 8 years of my life. I needed to salvage my own sense of who I was. The woman who'd walked into that dining room tonight was someone I recognized but didn't entirely like. She was hard, calculating, willing to use other people's vulnerabilities against them. She was everything Margaret had always accused me of being. The question was whether I could find a way to be strong without being cruel, powerful without being manipulative, successful without being destructive. Because the real victory wouldn't be proving I could destroy the Martinez family. It would be proving I could save it, including saving it from the worst impulses of everyone involved, including myself. Back in the dining room, Margaret was still sitting at the head of the table, but she looked smaller somehow, diminished. The papers scattered around her told the story of a woman who'd lost control of everything she'd spent years trying to manage. "Margaret," I said, taking my seat across from her, "we need to talk about how to fix this." She looked up with eyes that held no fight left. "Fix it? Rebecca, I don't think anything can be fixed after tonight. That depends on whether you're willing to tell the truth, all of it, about the loans, about the guarantees you made using my business, about why you really needed to control my company. And if I do, if I admit everything, then we figure out a way forward that doesn't destroy everyone involved, starting with you keeping your house and David avoiding bankruptcy." Hope flickered across her face like candlelight. "You'd do that? After what I tried to do to you?" "I'd do that because someone in this family needs to break the cycle of using power to hurt people instead of protect them." Margaret reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, the first genuinely affectionate gesture she'd made toward me in years. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I was so afraid of losing control that I lost sight of what really mattered. I was so focused on protecting the family that I forgot you are family. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal or rebuild the trust that had been shattered, but it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is the most powerful thing you can create."